In their evaluation of LaVey's study, William Bine and Bruce Parsons concluded that LaVey's study can be faulted for a number of technical flaws, such as variable method for tissue fixation, inadequate sexual histories, and small sample sizes. LaVey himself recognized the limitations and inadequacies of his study. In Queer Science, which was published in 1996, LaVey quite honestly admitted to a significant methodological problem with his study. He explains, "But it is important to stress limitations of the study. First, the observations were made on adults who had already been sexually active for years. To make a really compelling case, one would have to show that these neuroanatomical differences existed early in life, preferably at birth." In other words, the study is unable to answer questions about the etiology, about the origination and development of these neuroanatomical differences. But there is another very serious problem with LaVey's samples. Most of the homosexual men whose brains LaVey studied died of AIDS. In the same book, LaVey writes, "Another limitation arises because most of the gay men whose brains I studied died of complications of AIDS. Although I am confident that the small size INAH3 in these men was not an effect of the disease, there is always a possibility that gay men who died of AIDS is not representative of the entire population of gay men." Now, LaVey says that he is confident that the small size INAH3 in these men are not the effect of AIDS. But I find this statement rather unpersuasive because LaVey does not offer reasons for his confidence. Neither has he offered any reasons why we should rule out the possibility that the abnormality is the result of AIDS. Hypothetically speaking, even if LaVey has shown irrefutably and conclusively that there is a connection between the smaller size NIAH3 and homosexuality, he has not established that INAH3 is the cause of homosexual orientation, that this is the reason why these men are homosexuals. The distinction between causality and correlation is a very important one in neuroscience, and perhaps an example can illustrate this. Take psychopathology. There have been many studies conducted on psychopaths, especially the relationship between brain abnormality and psychopathological behavior. With the help of state-of-the-art neuroimaging technology, scientists are able to establish the link between the dysfunctions of the amygdala and the frontal lobe with psychopathy. But although many agree that there is a correlation between these brain abnormalities and psychopathic behavior, there is no agreement as to whether such behaviors are in fact caused by these brain abnormalities. And so, in his discussion on the diagnostic significance of neuroimaging, Walter Glennon maintains that although such studies can show correlations between normal and abnormal brain states and mental states, it cannot provide a causal explanation of the etiology and pathogenesis of neurological and psychiatric diseases. Neuroplasticity suggests that it could very well be the other way around. Neuroplasticity postulates that behavior can change the structure of the brain. And this means that the size of INAH3 in homosexual men could very well be the result of their sexual habits and their sexual behavior. A very instructive analogy of this would be a very important study conducted by NIH, which shows that the part of the brain that controls the reading finger of a Braille reader is larger than the part of the brain that controls the non-reading finger. LaVey was initially quite cautious with his conclusions, and in an interview with David Nimmons in March 1994, LaVey qualified his conclusions and findings in this way. It is important to stress what I didn't find. I did not prove that homosexuality is genetic or find a genetic cause for being gay. I didn't show that gay men are born that way, the most common mistake people make in interpreting my work. Nor did I locate a gay center in the brain. However, as he grew older, LaVey became more and more convinced that the genes were responsible for sexual orientation. And so in his response to the Sanders study, LaVey could say that this study knocks another nail into the coffin of the chosen lifestyle theory of homosexuality. And then he adds, rather dogmatically, yes, we have a choice in life to be ourselves or to conform to someone else's idea of normality. But being straight, bisexual, or gay, or none of these, is a central part of who we are, thanks in part to the DNA we are born with. But by making such a statement, LaVey is being thoroughly unscientific, ignoring the many studies whose results repeatedly and overwhelmingly demonstrate the crucial contributions of the environment, of life experiences to homosexual behavior. So Stanton L. Jones exposes LaVey's dogmatism when he writes, "The problem with LaVey's argument for an exclusively biological understanding of causation is not only that he overestimates the power of identifiable biological etiological variables, but that he refuses to engage all the considerable evidence for psychosocial contributors, and he attributes the unexplained remainder, that is, biological factors cannot explain, only to chance and various types of biological static." One of the most important, most influential studies is a study conducted by Alfred Kinsey and his associates that was published in 1948 as Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. In the FAQs on human sexuality published on its website in November 2014, the Health Promotion Board of Singapore based its understanding of human sexuality substantially, although not exclusively, on Kinsey's work. Here is the Health Promotion Board's FAQs on sexuality that uses the Kinsey's, my goodness, I can't even see it from here, that uses the Kinsey Scale as a tool for evaluating sexual preferences and sexual behavior. Who is Alfred Kinsey? Well, he was an Indiana zoologist, an expert not on human sexuality, but an expert on the gall wasp. In the middle of the 20th century, Kinsey and his associates focused their attention on the study of human sexuality and the sexual habits, resulting in two significant reports that rocked conservative American society and turned American sexual morals and morality upside down. Here are some shocking findings in the Kinsey reports. 85% of men and 45% of women had premarital sex. 50% of men and 40% of women had been unfaithful in their marriage. This is conservative America in the 1940s and the 1950s. Remember that. 69% of men had been with prostitutes, and 17% of farm boys had sex with animals. The male study, of course, received rave reviews from the media. Life, Time, Newsweek, The New Yorker, all carried sensational articles on the male report. The Kinsey reports on sexuality are seriously flawed because of the outrageously skewed samples that were used. In the male study in 1948, Kinsey surveyed numerous men to study their sexual habits, making it one of the most extensive surveys on male sexuality ever conducted. The problem, however, is that a significant percentage of the men surveyed, about 30%, were prison inmates, many of them sex offenders. One of Kinsey's closest collaborators, Wardell Pomeroy, reported that they took histories of 1,400 imprisoned sex offenders. And out of this group, 317% of them were themselves sexually abused as children. In addition, 75% of Kinsey's male subjects volunteered to give their sexual histories. Now, the use of volunteers in any study on sexuality is highly problematic because the result is seldom representative of the general population. Volunteers are generally tend to exaggerate their sexual prowess and their sexual activities. The volunteers in the Kinsey studies were 2 or 4 times more sexually active than the average male, which means that the results were outside the mainstream. W. Allen Wallace notes that the entire method of collecting and presenting the statistics underlie Dr. Kinsey's conclusions. There are 6 major aspects of any statistical research, and Kinsey fails 4. The statistics in the Kinsey reports do more than simply present the brute facts about sexual behavior, especially the sexual behavior of Americans in the 1940s and the 1950s. The reports are unreliable because they seriously distort the sexual habits of Americans. In reality, the Kinsey reports attempt not to report brute facts, but to promote a certain philosophy and a certain outlook that claims that the sexual behaviors that were once considered deviant are in fact biologically normal. They carry the message that says that human beings should not feel inhibited or guilty for acting on their natural impulses, and that whatever inhibitions and feelings of guilt that might have arisen are due to social conventions which science is now challenging. As Paul Robinson puts it, Kinsey evaluated every form of sexual activity in terms of its role in the sexual lives of the lower species. And he frequently concluded that outlawed sexual practices were entirely natural because they conform to basic mammalian patterns. And so in the male report, Kinsey argues that it is society that imposes artificial distinctions such as right and wrong, licit and illicit, normal and abnormal, acceptable and unacceptable in our social organization. Now, Kinsey also introduced a novel approach to understanding human sexuality. Before Kinsey, people are generally thought to be either heterosexual or homosexual, with heterosexuality being the dominant orientation. Kinsey rejected this binary approach and presented a view of human sexuality as fluid and elastic. According to Kinsey, people are rarely strictly heterosexual or homosexual. Rather, human sexuality must be seen as being part of a continuum. Kinsey developed a way of gauging sexual preferences and behavior, and he presented what is now called the Kinsey Scale. If you look at the scale, 0 stands for exclusively heterosexual with no homosexual inclinations whatsoever. Number 1, predominantly heterosexual, but more incidentally homosexual. Number 2, predominantly heterosexual, but more than, very precise language, more than incidentally homosexual. Number 3, equally heterosexual and homosexual. Number 4, predominantly homosexual, but incidentally heterosexual. Number 5, predominantly homosexual, but more than incidentally heterosexual. And number 6, exclusively homosexual. If you study the scale carefully, you will notice that only at 0 is there no homosexual inclination at all. Anyone falling between 1 and 6, which was for Kinsey the majority, would have different degrees of homosexual inclination. So in a way, the Kinsey scale has done much to normalize homosexuality. The Kinsey scale is widely used as a standard for evaluating sexuality. It is used, as I said earlier, by the Health Promotion Board of Singapore to explain sexuality. But the Kinsey scale is nothing but conjecture. Conjecture based on skewed research and biased data. Like all of Kinsey's work, the scale attempts to impose his understanding of human sexuality. It is therefore dangerously misleading. Now, besides the Kinsey scale, the assertion in the Mail report that 10% of men between ages 16 and 55 were homosexual is also extremely problematic. Although these statistics have to do with American society, it very quickly becomes representative of many countries and societies. The idea that homosexuals make up 10% of every population is a myth, and it is a myth that must be exposed and rejected. According to the National Health Statistics Report published in July 2014, only 1.6% of the 43,557 American adults surveyed are identified as gay or lesbian, and 0.7% as bisexual. 96.6% is heterosexual. From 1990 to 2010, about 30 surveys have been conducted in Europe based on representative samples. The results show that homosexuality and bisexuality constitutes only 2 to 3% of the population. Neil and Briar Whitehead present a useful summary of the findings of these 30 surveys that have been conducted in the course of 20 years. About 1% of the adult male population is exclusively homosexual. About 0.6% of the population is exclusively lesbian. If bisexuals are included, the figure rises to 2.9 plus or minus 2% for men, and 1.8 plus or minus 1.3% for women. And this means that only around 2.4% of the total population is homosexual, lesbian, or bisexual. It is interesting to note that even prominent gay and lesbian activists reject the 10% figure proposed by Kinsey. So for example, in his book, City of Friends, surprise, surprise, Simon LeVay states that Kinsey's sampling and interviewing procedures would not be considered scientifically valid today. More recent studies have consistently produced figures lower than 10%. In similar vein, Camille Paglia, who identifies herself as a libertarian and lesbian woman, writes, "The 10% figure, servilely repeated by the media, was pure propaganda, and it made me, as a scholar, despise gay activists for their unscrupulous disregard for the truth." My final section, I promise you. I would like now to turn very briefly to a very interesting but also chilling and alarming story of how the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, changed its diagnosis of homosexuality. In 1974, the APA removed homosexuality from the list of pathological psychiatric conditions published in what is known as the Bible for psychiatrists and psychologists, called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness. Its revised verdict states that homosexuality per se is one form of sexual behavior, and like other forms of sexual behavior which are not themselves psychiatric disorders, it's not listed in the nomenclature of mental disorders. However, just 10 years before this publication, in 1963, the Committee on Public Health of the New Academy of Medicine quite clearly and categorically stated that homosexuality is indeed an illness. The homosexual is an emotionally disturbed individual who has not acquired the normal capacity to develop satisfying heterosexual relations. What happened in the intervening years that led the medical community to change its mind about homosexuality in such a radical way? One would have thought that such a change would only be warranted if science has proven conclusively that homosexuality or homosexual orientation is innate. However, what forced the APA to change its position on homosexuality was not science, but gay politics. In his 1981 book, still in print, entitled Homosexuality and American Psychiatry, the subtitle is very telling, The Politics of Diagnosis, Ronald Bayer describes how gay activists had forced APA to overturn its position on homosexuality. Ronald Bayer is a professor of socio-medical sciences at the Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Bayer reported that in 1970, gay activists were determined to disrupt the annual meetings of the American Psychiatric Association. And Bayer relates an incident when gay activists disrupted and challenged a prominent psychoanalyst, Irving Biber, while he was presenting a paper at an APA meeting. He reports, Biber's effort to explain his position were met with derisive laughter. One protester called him "I've read your book, Dr. Biber." Use your imagination. "I've read your book, Dr. Biber, and if that book talked about black people the way it talks about homosexuals, you'd be drawn and quartered, and you deserve it." To cut the long story short, the gay activists managed to get an audience with the APA's Committee on Nomenclature and convinced the committee to concede that homosexuality is not a psychiatric disorder. In addition, the National Gay Task Force sent letters to 30,000 members of the APA to get support for this change. And under extreme pressure, the majority of the members voted in favor of the new classification of homosexuality. In his book, Ronald Bayer chillingly states that this triumph was not the result of science, but of ideology. Ideology and the prevailing cultural sensibilities. The result was not a conclusion based upon an approximation of the scientific truth as dictated by reason, but was instead an action demanded by the ideological temper of the times. Albert Dean Bird and Stoney Olson offered the same assessment when they wrote, "Thus, the only official communication on the vote, a supposed search for the truth, came from the activists, who later even admitted that they rammed the change through. The result was inevitable, and the headlines announced that homosexuality has been cured. The stigma of a disease was gone due to politics." Assessing the whole incident, the American psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, physician, and author Charles W. Socrates states that the decision remains a chilling reminder that if scientific principles are not fought for, they can be lost. A disillusioning warning that unless we make no exceptions to science, we are subject to the snares of political factionalism and the propagation of untruth to an unsuspecting and uninformed public, to the rest of the medical profession, and to the behavioral sciences. Now, once homosexuality is no longer an illness, it must no longer be treated as a taboo. And once homosexuality is no longer a taboo, a new taboo emerges. It is now taboo to postulate that homosexuality is a disorder that can be treated or cured. To make such an assertion is to discriminate against gays and lesbians whose sexual orientation must now be seen as innate or genetic and not the result of psychological pathology. New neologisms are then introduced to justify clinical practices. Egosyntonic homosexuals are those who are at peace with their homosexuality, while ego-dystonic homosexuals are those who struggle with their homosexuality. According to APA, both forms of homosexualities are not disorders, but the latter form, the ego-dystonic variety of homosexuals, should undergo treatment. But what sort of treatment? Treatment does not have to do with helping them overcome their same-sex attraction. Rather, it has to do with helping them to accept their homosexuality and cope and overcome what has been described as their internalized homophobia. Accompanying this trend, gay activists have introduced a very powerful narrative that any attempt to reverse homosexuality through reparative therapies have been unsuccessful. This is the narrative that they have introduced. This narrative is so powerful that it has almost become mainstream dogma. And so this is how the logic goes. Homosexuality is natural, therefore it is irreversible. Homosexuality is irreversible because it is natural. But this simply goes against the facts. Here is a table of the success rates of reparative therapies offered by secular psychiatrists and psychologists. The success rates offered by religious-based organizations is slightly higher than those offered by secular programs. So let's look at them randomly. In the Bible study, right at the top, out of 106 homosexuals who were treated, 44 of them, or 42%, were successful in overcoming their same-sex attractions. The ETHOS study, which surveyed a higher number of homosexuals who have undergone therapy, produced similar results. Out of 143 that were treated, 67 of them, or 47%, successfully overcame their same-sex attraction. The highest score in the table, at 82%, is a study conducted by Freeman and Mayer, although they worked with much fewer cases. But if we look at the composite numbers right at the bottom, we find the results are quite encouraging. Out of 504 homosexuals who underwent therapy, 262 successfully overcame their homosexual tendencies. This is about 51.98%. The results clearly point to the fact that it is simply not true to say, that homosexuality is irreversible. And now, to your relief, I conclude. The many studies that have been conducted over more than 20 years have all failed to show convincingly, much less conclusively, that a gene or a cluster of genes or our brains are directly responsible for homosexuality. As Jeffrey Satinova has put it, hard science is far from providing an explanation of homosexuality, let alone one that reduces it to genetic determinism. Instead, these studies have shown that homosexual behavior is a multifactorial phenomenon. Biological factors influence same-sex attraction only in a predisposing way. Other factors, such as intrauterine and extrauterine influences, familial and environmental conditions, social experiences, all these make significant contributions to sexual preferences and behavior. In addition, given the fact that reparative therapies have enjoyed some success, it is not unreasonable at all to say that non-genetic factors appear to play a critical role in homosexuality. Neil and Brian Whitehead summarize our discussion very well when they write, "Here is a very basic truth. There is nothing fixed or final about the homosexual orientation and its natural expression, homosexual behavior. No one has to stay homosexual or lesbian in orientation or behavior. Homosexuality is not inborn, not genetically dictated, not immutable." I thank you.